My father didn't clear his throat, didn't adjust his sleeves, didn't give me even half a second to prepare. He just pushed a polished folder across the table like he was sliding ownership of the world to someone else. And he said my sister's name with that tone he only used for things he considered noble or perfect, Lina. 7 letters that hovered in the air like a decision already carved in stone. She had been home for 7 days. 7. I'd carried my parents for 10 years. Not months, not a season, 10 full years of emergencies, crisis calls, insurance fights, audits, broken printers, missing staff, exhausted nurses, broken elevators, frightened families, and long nights breathing in recycle facility air because I didn't have time to breathe anything else. My mother's nod was the loudest sound in the room, not the scrape of the chair legs, not the hum of the old AC unit, not even the soft tap of my own pulse in my ears. Just that nod, sharp, decisive, final. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even let my face move. I placed the power of attorney beside the house keys. The metal hit the table with a sound so small you wouldn't think it could change anything, but somehow it sliced the room clean in half. Everyone thought I was surrendering. Everyone thought I was stepping down. Nobody realized I was stepping out. And when Lina opened the letter I left in that folder, the one written in plain language, because truth doesn't need complicated words, she didn't read it twice. She didn't have to. You only need one moment to understand when the ground under your feet was never really yours. I grew up in long hallways that always smelled like antiseptic, lavender, and something faintly metallic underneath it all. That's the smell of caretaking. Not the warm, cozy kind you see in commercials, but the real thing. The one built on routines, protocols, gloves snapped on at 3 a.m., and lights humming endlessly overhead. My father always walked ahead of me, long strides, confident voice, a smile ready for every resident. He remembered everyone's name, even the ones he only met twice. I used to trail behind him, pushing a wheelchair I was too small to handle, standing on my toes so the wheels didn't drift sideways. He'd glance back and say, "Careful, Cara," with a smile that passed over me the same way headlights pass over a road sign, briefly without stopping. Then he'd turn back to whoever he actually cared about impressing. Lina never trailed behind anyone in her entire life. She floated. She entered rooms like she was the soft center of the spotlight. Dresses swayed around her, curls caught the light. Laughter pulled the eyes in any room like gravity had chosen her, and only her, to orbit around. My mother staged her like a museum piece, posed her near holiday decorations, staircases, decorated tables, photos everywhere. Lina glowing in the front, and somewhere blurred in the background, me holding a clipboard, fixing something, carrying something, doing something useful that didn't earn a caption. Even as kids, the division was rehearsed. Lina got opportunity, I got obligation. Lina got, she's so talented, I got, she's so responsible. Lina got doors opened for her, I got keys. You're independent, my parents told everyone, as if it was a gift, as if independence was something they nurtured in me instead of something they demanded because it made their lives easier. When Lina complained about homework, they hired a tutor. When I brought home straight A's, my father nodded once, barely glancing up from his laptop. Expected from you. There was one birthday that still tastes like dust in my memory. Lina's party. Sparklers shooting out of a custom cake, gold balloons, 20 relatives clapping, music loud enough to rattle the windows. My birthday came 2 months later. A grocery store sheet cake left on the counter, half frosted, leaning. My mother kissed my cheek and reminded me to grab my uniform before heading to the facility for my evening shift. I was 16. The shift wasn't mandatory. The mortgage was. I didn't resent Lina then. She wasn't the architect of the imbalance. She simply thrived in the soil they watered. But I learned early that wanting anything for myself made me inconvenient, so I stopped wanting. I filled medication drawers, I folded towels, I helped residents write holiday cards. I became the girl who fixed problems so efficiently that no one bothered asking if I was okay. By adulthood, everything was locked into place. Lina left for the city to pursue a creative media career, something my parents spoke about with the pride of people who believed they were raising a prodigy. When she called home, it was for money. They sent it every time. Meanwhile, my father got sick, then my mother, the business faltered, staff walked out, regulations tightened, new policies hit the industry like falling bricks. The person they turned to wasn't the daughter they worshipped. It was me. I signed the power of attorney on a vinyl hospital chair at 2 in the morning. The overhead bulb flickered like it was deciding whether to stay alive. My mother watched me sign like she'd always known I would. "You're good with the serious things," she whispered. It wasn't praise, it was classification. Some nights after back-to-back shifts, I caught my reflection in the facility's glass doors. Straight posture, hair tied back, tablet in hand. I didn't look like someone in her 20s. I looked like someone who had already lived 40 years and was on year 41 without rest. I thought that was my place, not chosen, assigned. Then the shift began, quietly. Storms don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they creep in the corners while you're too busy fixing everything else to notice the air changing. At first, it was an email about state inspections that didn't include me, then a staffing audit discussion without my name, then a meeting about succession planning, one I only heard about because a nurse asked why I wasn't presenting the operational report. I remember standing in the cold supply room holding a box of wound dressings. My phone buzzed. A photo from my mother, Lina, smiling in front of the facility sign, her hair swept back by the breeze like the world was staging the moment for her. Caption, "Future Leadership." I stared at it until the screen went dark. Then another message, an invitation graphic, gold lettering, family legacy celebration. No mention of me, no input from me, no acknowledgement that I had kept the entire operation alive for a decade. Just a date, a location, and the quiet implication. So we've already moved on. That evening, I walked into my parents' kitchen. It smelled like roasted peppers and lemon. My father leaned against the counter, talking softly to Lina about vision and strategy and the next chapter. My mother nodded like she was watching a prophecy unfold. I stood there, waiting to be noticed. I wasn't. When my father finally looked up, he smiled absent-mindedly. "Cara, you don't need to worry about the administrative stuff right now. You've done enough heavy lifting. It's time for Lina to take on bigger responsibilities." Bigger. The word hit like cold water to the chest. My mother touched my wrist. "You're good with the behind the scenes things. Let her shine." Behind the scenes. That was the moment. The one where something inside me didn't crack, it clicked. Later, I found a folder on the dining table, financial projections in Lena's handwriting, numbers that didn't add up, formulas broken, plans impossible, and yet my parents had signed their initials in the corner like they were approving a masterpiece. They had already decided. I sat down, looked at the papers, let the silence settle, and something inside me went still, not wounded, not angry, focused. Because the truth stood there, calm and obvious. They made me the scaffolding, but scaffolding holds everything up, and scaffolding can be removed. So I closed the folder, stood up slowly, walked upstairs to the light, hard, steady, mind sharper than it had ever been. If you've ever reached that quiet point where you realize you're done begging to be seen, tell me, say something. Let me know I'm not the only one who stepped out of a role everyone else assumed I'd die in. In my room that night, the air felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like someone had finally wiped down a fogged window I'd been squinting through my entire life. I sat on the edge of the same bed I'd slept on since childhood, the same pale blue walls staring back at me in their quiet, indifferent way. They hadn't changed. I had. My tablet sat beside me, its dim screen glowing softly across my hands like it knew it was about to become something more than a tool for schedules and medication logs. I opened a blank document. No title, no headings, no emotion, just a space ready to hold whatever truth I allowed into it. And the first thing I typed was a timeline. 10 years, compressed, distilled, crisis by crisis. The overnight emergencies, the regulatory freezes, the year Medicaid nearly cut us off. A month, our staffing dropped so low, I worked 3 double shifts in a row and slept in an empty patient room because there was no time to go home. The outbreaks, the inspector warnings, the vendor negotiations, the broken HVAC system on the hottest week in July, the night my father collapsed, the morning my mother couldn't remember her own passwords. All of it. 10 years of holding up a world everyone assumed ran perfectly because I made sure they never saw how close it had come to collapsing. Next, I built the second entry: licenses, compliance standards, contracts, hospital partnership, binder accounts, cross-state regulatory renewals, everything the business needed to exist legally and operationally. Most people see buildings and assume the value is in the walls. They don't understand that care facilities are held together by paper, licenses, inspections, protocols, agreements, paper that I managed, paper that I maintained, paper that I understood down to the smallest clause. Then I wrote the third entry: every inspector who trusted my reports, every physician who reviewed our care protocols, every caseworker who called me directly when a family panicked, every hospital department that routed its referrals through my line, not my parents. Names, numbers, notes. I didn't have to argue I mattered. The proof was already stitched into the backbone of the system. I didn't need to build a case. The case already existed. All I had to do was finally assemble it. When the sun was still a rumor against the horizon, I drove across Savannah. The streets were washed in a faint gray light, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath before deciding what kind of day it wants to become. I parked outside Dr. Hale's office. His lights were already on. He was the kind of man who didn't sleep unless truth did. He opened the door before I even knocked. He didn't ask why I was there. He had watched my exhaustion over the years, the way doctors watch a long-term illness, with quiet understanding and no illusions. His office smelled like cedar and old paper, a room that didn't need decoration because its purpose was honesty. I placed my notes on the table. He read through them silently, glasses sliding down his nose, fingers turning each page slowly. He wasn't reading the words. He was weighing them. When he finished, he leaned back, his chair creaking the way old truth sometimes does. "We're moving without you," he said. I nodded. "And you're done asking to be seen?" Another nod. He tapped the edge of my timeline with one weathered finger. "You don't need revenge. You need structure." That sentence settled into my bones more cleanly than anything else had in years. Revenge would have kept me connected to them. Structure would set me free. That afternoon, he called someone named Rowan. I'd heard the name whispered by administrators who thought she was a myth, someone who only showed up when systems needed to be rebuilt from the inside out. She arrived with a leather portfolio and an expression that held the calm of someone who'd spent decades navigating crises that would break most people. She reviewed everything I brought: contracts, emails, compliance logs, licenses, the power of attorney papers. Her eyes scanned each page with the precision of someone who could dismantle a business blindfold. Her lips tightened only once when she reached the financial projections Lina had written. "They're planning a transfer," she said quietly, "but they have no idea what they're transferring." "Explain it to me." I told her. She tapped the licensing packet first. "This is the real spine. Without these, the facilities aren't facilities, they're empty buildings." Then she tapped the compliance protocols I'd written over years of refining and adjusting. "This is intellectual property. You built it." Finally, she lifted the partnership list: hospitals, specialists, agencies, referral chains, state departments. "And this is institutional capital. It doesn't follow a last name. It follows the person who makes the system work." I sat very still. "You can protect everything you built," she continued, "not by fighting them, by outstructuring them." We spent the next week designing a framework that wasn't about ownership. It was about protection, a nonprofit foundation, not tied to a family, not tied to ego, not tied to outdated ideas of who deserved credit. A structure for safeguarding the protocols, the brand, the partnerships, the data system. The name came to me quietly: Harbor Bridge Foundation, a bridge built for people who needed steadiness, a harbor for the ones who trusted us under my authority as power of attorney, still fully valid, still fully legal, still never rescinded. I signed the transfers, every document notarized, filed, recorded. My parents thought it was routine administrative cleanup for their health and stability. They signed honorary advisory roles without reading the fine print. No ownership and no control, just recognition for their name. And when it was finished, I returned to work like nothing had changed, moved through hallways, checked logs, adjusted schedules. The staff greeted me with the quiet respect of people who remembered who kept them afloat. Lina floated through the rooms with a notebook and a soft, airy smile, offering color palette ideas for the website. Sometimes the things people envy are so small it's almost funny. The night before the legacy celebration, I sat in the small office behind the nurses' station. The lights buzzed overhead in their familiar, slightly irritating way. My tablet glowed with one last document, a letter addressed to Lina. Not angry, not dramatic, just clear. I wrote what she was inheriting: a shell without the system, a title without the infrastructure, a responsibility she wasn't trained for. I explained the foundation, not to shame her, but to show her the truth my parents refused to see. Ended with a single line that felt like walking out of a shadow: "What you carry next depends on what you choose to hold." Printed it, folded it, slipped it into a red envelope. On the day of the celebration, I dropped the envelope into my bag beside the keys and the power of attorney document. 3 objects, 3 truths. And on the drive over, for the first time in my life, I realized I felt calm. If you've ever had that moment where peace isn't soft, it's sharp, where it feels like clarity carving you free, tell me. I want to know who else has stepped out of a role everyone assumed you'd endure forever. The celebration looked warm from the doorway, almost beautiful in that curated way families create moments they want the world to believe are real. Soft amber lights glowed over linen napkins folded into delicate shapes. Crystal glasses caught reflections like small chandeliers placed in everyone's hands. The air felt full of expectation, but not the kind that invites you in, the kind that tells you the script has already been written and you're here only because someone forgot to remove your name from the guest list. My parents stood near the head of the table, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was the glow of people who believed a prophecy was being fulfilled. Lina sat between them, posture perfect, fingers grazing the stem of her glass as if even the gesture had been coached. She looked like someone stepping into royalty, not responsibility. My father tapped his spoon against a plate. The room quieted instantly. His voice carried across the table with the confidence of a man who had decided the ending of a story before the halfway mark. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, smiling at the room. "Tonight, we honor the future of our family's work." He turned to Lina with that proud tilt of his chin, the one he used on her and only her. "She's ready to lead." My mother nodded, lips curved into the soft smile she reserved for moments she believed were historic. She deserves it. Those words didn't sting. I expected them. They were simply the natural end to a script they'd been rehearsing since we were children. I had just never realized they thought I would dutifully clap in the background forever. The applause faded. I stood, not abruptly, not loudly, just enough to shift the air in the room, just enough for chairs to stop moving and conversations to quiet, just enough for people to finally look at me directly, not as the helper, not as the supporting character, but as someone they had underestimated for so long. They forgot she had her own spine. I placed 3 items on the table in front of me. The keys, the power of attorney document, and the red envelope. The keys made the smallest sound, a crisp metallic tap that cut straight through the warm air like a thin blade. It was the kind of sound that says, "Pay attention, something is ending." My father frowned. "Cara, this isn't necessary." I slid the keys toward Lina. "It's all yours." Some guests smiled politely, thinking I was being gracious. Others stiffened, sensing the wrong kind of quiet settling over the table, the kind that makes the back of your neck tense because some truth is about to step into the room. Lina reached for the red envelope first. Her fingers traced its edge like she already felt the weight inside. She unfolded the letter once, twice. Her eyes skimmed the first lines and sharpened. Her breathing shifted. The pages fluttered in her hands like something alive and panicked. She flipped to the next page, then the next. Her spine straightened, then curved, then straightened again. A person trying to hold their poise while the ground tilts under them. "What is this?" she whispered, and no one answered. The silence answered for us. She kept reading each line, pulling the color from her face, her hands tightening around the pages until her knuckles went white. Then her voice rose, thin and disbelieving. "No, no, this can't be right." Her chair screeched backward as she stood, startling half the room. The noise was sharp, unplanned, honest. It was the sound of someone whose life had been curated, suddenly hitting the raw edge of reality for the first time. My father grabbed the papers from her, his face drained, slowly, painfully, like someone watching their reflection crack. He read the section outlining the transfers, the brand, the protocols, the operational rights, the licensing agreements, all placed under Harbor Bridge Foundation. His fingers trembled. "Cara, what did you do?" I didn't say a word. My mother snatched a page, scanning it in frantic bursts, her eyes darting like she was looking for a sentence that would undo everything she feared was true. This says we don't own any of this. The facilities are buildings," I said quietly, "just buildings." The room fell into a hush, so deep even the clinking silverware held its breath. In the far corner, a man rose from his chair, Mr. Hayes, Harbor Bridge's attorney. He had blended into the room all evening, unnoticed, polite, invisible until the exact moment his presence mattered. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Everything in that packet is accurate. The transfers were executed 3 years ago while Miss Hart held full legal authority to act on behalf of her parents." My father's voice cracked without our consent. With your signatures, Hayes corrected. We have medical verification and third-party oversight confirming the necessity. Lina looked from him to me, eyes wide, breath unsteady. So, what did they just give me? Hayes folded his hands. Two aging properties and the debt tied to them. Any operational authority would require certification from Harbor Bridge. My mother's voice broke. She can meet the standards, she can learn. Hayes lifted a single sheet. If staffing ratios drop, if safety protocols lapse, if any core process deviates by even a small percentage, Harbor Bridge can revoke the license within 60 days. Without a license, the buildings cannot operate. My father whispered, "So, we have nothing." I didn't correct him. They had exactly what they valued: appearance without structure, a title without substance, a crown with no kingdom beneath it. Lena sank back into her seat, the letter limp in her hands. The poised confidence she held all evening dissolved. Her shoulders folded inward like a house losing its frame. "I thought I was taking over something real," she whispered. "You were," I finally said. "The responsibility, the work, the actual system. You just never saw it." Hayes closed the folder. "This arrangement protects the seniors, the staff, the integrity of the care system. It is not punitive, it is structural." My parents stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the daughter who carried them, not as the dependable one, but as the person who finally chose not to keep carrying what never belonged on my shoulders. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't argue. I didn't soften the edges. Some truths are meant to land exactly as they are, and some silences are louder than shouting could ever be. When I stepped away from the table, the room watched me the way people watch someone walking out of a burning building without a scratch, unable to understand how she survived, unable to understand how they didn't notice she was the one holding the fire extinguisher the entire time. And if you've ever walked away from a moment where everyone finally had to face who you became after years of assuming you'd stay small, tell me. I want to hear the moment you realized you weren't invisible anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of guilt, not because of second guessing, and definitely not because of regret. I didn't sleep because the house felt hollow in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't empty, it was just finally free of the constant weight of expectation pressing against the walls. Silence has a different temperature when it's not laced with dread. It felt like stepping into a room it wasn't know existed, inside myself. My phone stayed dark on the nightstand. No late night calls from staff, no emergency alerts, no medication reminders, no crisis texts, no one asking if I could cover for someone who didn't show up. For the first time in years, I didn't have to brace myself for responsibility the moment I opened my eyes. Morning didn't rush me. It didn't demand anything from me. It didn't even feel like it belonged to anyone else. By sunrise, the consequences were already unfolding, but none of them belonged to me anymore. I didn't avoid them. I just wasn't the one they were routed to. And that difference was sharper than any victory could have been. Bank emails, the staff resignations, the compliance notices, the unanswered vendor inquiries. Every one of them arrived exactly where responsibility had been placed, not in my hands. Still, I drove to New Harbor Bridge before sunrise, not because they needed me and not because I felt obligated, but because that place was the closest thing I'd ever had to a life I built myself. The windows glowed a soft amber, catching the first light of the river. It always looked gentler in the morning, like the building itself understood the people inside were vulnerable and needed softness before the day hardened. Inside, volunteers were setting up for morning activities. Someone in the recreation room was tuning the piano, soft, tentative notes drifting through the hallway like a reminder that life keeps moving, even when families fall apart. I walked into my office, small, plain, quiet. But the morning light softened every surface, the edge of the desk, the stack of folders, the muted art on the wall. I set down my keys and exhaled. A slow, steady release, the kind that drops straight from your chest into the floor. Later that week, I saw my parents in the Medicaid waiting room. The chairs were the uncomfortable plastic kind that dig into your spine if you don't sit perfectly still. They sat close together, hands clasped, staring straight ahead at a poster about coverage qualifications. They looked smaller than I'd ever seen them, like the world had finally shrunk to the size they always assumed mine would be. They didn't see me pass by. I didn't stop, not out of anger, not out of revenge, not out of anything fiery or loud. I didn't stop because there was nothing left to fix and nothing left for me to carry. A month later, during a site visit, I saw Lina. She was in one of the allied facilities, pushing a resident's wheelchair down the hall, slowly, carefully. No camera in sight, no audience, no applause. Her movements were small, deliberate, uncertain. She didn't notice me, and I didn't interrupt. There was something almost tender in seeing her like that, stripped of the spotlight, stripped of illusions, learning what real responsibility felt like without anyone curating it for her. I watched for a moment, not to judge, not to gloat, just to witness the beginning of something honest. Some people only grow when comfort is removed. Some truths only bloom in silence. Some lessons only take root when the shine falls away. I walked the rest of the hallway with a calm I didn't recognize. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like space, clean, quiet, earned. Not every story ends with noise. Not every ending needs to be dramatic. Sometimes the most powerful ending is simply stepping out of the role you were trapped in and realizing the world didn't collapse without you. The world just reorganized itself around the truth. No fireworks, no applause, final reckoning, just a clean line drawn in quiet. Because families fracture loudly, but boundaries settle like dust. Soft, inevitable, impossible to sweep away once you stop pretending you're the one holding everything up. Freedom didn't come from winning anything, it came from walking away from problems I never volunteered to adopt. Real freedom is when you stop showing up to a role everyone else wrote for you, and the silence afterward feels like breathing for the first time. And if you've ever had that moment where the quiet after the storm doesn't scare you but frees you, tell me. I want to know who else stepped out of the room where they were expected to save everyone. The weeks that followed didn't feel like aftermath, they felt like calibration. Like the world was adjusting to a shift in gravity it didn't realize had already happened years ago, the moment my parents started depending on me without ever saying the words out loud. Harbor Bridge ran the same way it always had, with protocol schedules and standards too stable to wobble just because my family's illusion cracked. But inside myself, something subtle rearranged. It was almost eerie how quickly the old reflexes tried to return. The urge to check on everything, the instinct to anticipate every problem, the automatic guilt that crept in whenever something went wrong, even when I had nothing to do with it. But each time that old weight tried to settle back onto my shoulders, it hit the boundary I'd finally drawn and slid off. People talk about boundaries like they're fences. They're not. They're gravity shifts. Once you adjust the pull, everything falls into its rightful place. One morning, a nurse walked into my office with a puzzled expression. Cara, did you know the Smithfield facility called your parents about the weekend audit instead of calling headquarters? I looked up from my tablet, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel urgency. I didn't feel the impulse to fix it. I didn't feel that familiar coil of responsibility tightening around my ribs. You'll sort it out, I said. The nurse blinked. She'd only ever known one version of me, the one who stepped into problems faster than anyone could hand them over. Seeing me sit still must have felt like watching a river pause mid flow, and I understood something in that moment. People get used to the person who always carries everything. They forget it's a behavior, not destiny. They forget it can stop. By the second month, my parents weren't just overwhelmed, they were being swallowed by details they'd never bothered to understand. Payment cycles, licensing renewals, staffing ratios, procurement chains, patient family disputes. The machinery of a care system is unforgiving. It doesn't care who your favorite child is or whose picture you framed in your hallway. My mother called me once, just once. Her voice was thin, the way a voice sounds when pride is doing most of the talking and exhaustion is doing the rest. We're trying, Cara. There was a pause on the line, a long one. Everything's harder than it looks. I didn't rush to soothe her. I didn't jump in with solutions. I didn't step into the role she was reaching for. I just listened. And when the silence stretched enough to make space for truth, I said, I know. And that was enough. Not because it fixed anything, but because it wasn't my job to fix it. I hung up and didn't feel the usual pull in my chest. No guilt, no temptation to rescue, just a quiet certainty that this was exactly the distance things were supposed to have had all along. Meanwhile, the staff carried on, the residents laughed, the piano in the recreation room played its uneven morning melody. Life continued in the ways that mattered. My work wasn't heroic, it was structural. Systems don't need applause, they need steadiness. One afternoon, as I walked through the north hallway, Mrs. Whitaker, a resident who always wore cardigans the color of faded sunsets, reached out and touched my hand. Thank you for keeping this place safe, she said. I felt that, not the praise, her voice. It cracked slightly on the word safe. Most people don't understand what that word truly means to the elderly until they've held the back end of a care facility together for a decade. Safe isn't a feeling, it's a system, a design, 1,000 tiny decisions no one sees. And it struck me that I had built something quieter than legacy and louder than recognition, a structure that didn't collapse when I stepped out. As I left her room, an unexpected thought came over me. I hadn't lost anything. I had simply stopped giving my life away in places that never noticed they were receiving it. One evening after closing rounds, I stepped outside into the cooling dusk. A soft breeze swept across the parking lot, carrying the smell of river water and fresh cut grass, the kind of breeze that feels like a reset button. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening, breathing, not rushing, and it hit me with a clarity that felt almost electric. This is what it feels like when your life finally belongs to you. Not borrowed, not redirected, not squeezed around other people's needs. Yeah, yours. If you've ever had that moment when your life stops being a reaction and starts being your own quiet decision, I want to know. It's strange how many of us walk around with a weight we didn't ask to carry, and how freeing it is when you finally put it down on purpose. And once you feel that shift, you can't unfeel it. By the end of that first season, without them leaning on me, I realized something strange. Peace has its own learning curve. You don't slide into it. You don't wake up one day suddenly fluent in it. Peace is a language you relearn after years of speaking only urgency. There were mornings I walked into Harbor Bridge expecting to be greeted by chaos, expecting to hear my name shouted from down the hall, expecting a clipboard thrust into my hands, expecting someone to say, "We need you right now," because for a decade, that sentence was my alarm clock. But none of that came. The world didn't fall apart. The building didn't collapse. The system didn't crumble. My absence from their burden didn't create a void. It revealed the truth. I was never the only one capable. I was just the only one they allowed to carry everything. And once I walked away, the weight redistributed to where it always belonged. At first, that emptiness felt wrong. I wasn't used to waking up without a crisis waiting. I wasn't used to handing tasks back to people whose job it actually was. I wasn't used to redirecting instead of absorbing. People who grow up carrying everyone else's responsibilities have to learn how to unclench. One day, a resident's daughter rushed into my office, panic bright in her eyes. Mom's missing. They can't find her. The old version of me would have run, full sprint, every nerve firing. But before I could stand, one of the care coordinators appeared behind her, calm, confident. We found her in the garden. She said she's safe. The daughter exhaled. Tears fell. Relief softened her shoulders. A year ago, that moment would have ended with me drenched in sweat from sprinting across the facility. Now, someone else handled it. Someone capable, someone trained, someone who didn't need me to validate their competence. And that small moment taught me something bigger. When you stop being the person everyone dumps their panic on, they step into their own roles. People rise when you stop shrinking yourself to fill the gaps. Still, change never happens in a straight line. My parents tried to reach out in small, awkward ways. A forgotten voicemail, a text that didn't ask for help but didn't know how to say anything else, an email forwarded by mistake, one that clearly wasn't meant for me, asking a lawyer if there was a way to reverse the damage. Damage. Guess what they called my boundary? I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because the distance wasn't punishment, it was balance. You don't call a boundary damage unless you've spent your whole life benefiting from someone having none. Lina was quieter than them. I heard things through the professional grapevine, her proposals getting rejected, her meetings ending abruptly, her plans falling apart because every idea she had was infrastructure she assumed would catch her. But infrastructure doesn't respond to charm, it responds to competence. The reality of responsibility was teaching her more than I ever could. One afternoon, I walked in on her training a new volunteer at one of the facilities. The volunteer looked overwhelmed, holding a clipboard like it was a heavy object. Lina's voice trembled as she tried to sound authoritative. You have to make sure the medication logs are double checked, she said. The volunteer blinked. How? Where are the logs? Lena hesitated. I could see it. She didn't know, not in detail, not in process, not enough to guide someone else. She'd always been positioned to lead something. She never learned to operate. She saw me in the doorway and stiffened. Her cheeks flushed. Her eyes dropped. And in that moment, I didn't feel superiority. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clarity. Not everyone is built for the role their family casts them in. Not everyone's gifts shine where their parents placed them. Not everyone thrives on a pedestal. I almost stepped in, almost explained the system, almost eased her embarrassment. But then I stopped. Not because I didn't care, but because stepping in would have robbed her of the thing she desperately needed more than rescuing: experience. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let someone meet the truth of what they asked for. I turned and walked away. Later that night, while leaving the building, I passed one of the old cherry trees near the parking lot. It had started to bloom again, soft pink petals unfolding against the twilight. It struck me how nature doesn't ask permission to start over. It doesn't ask if it's allowed to outgrow last season. It doesn't wait for approval from the trees around it. It blooms when it's ready, quietly, boldly. without apology. And for the first time in a long time, I felt myself opening in the same way. Not dramatically, not loudly, just steadily. There's a moment people don't talk about when you reclaim your life. The world doesn't clap for you. It doesn't cheer. It doesn't hand you a medal. It simply gives you back the hours you used to lose to exhaustion, the mind you used to drown in other people's emergencies, the dreams you had quietly folded away. What you do with those hours tells the real story. That night, sitting in my car with the windows down, breathing in the cool air, I realized something simple but enormous. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was starting. If you've ever had that moment where starting over didn't feel like a struggle but a release, I want to hear it. The quiet beginnings matter just as much as the loud endings. Spring eased into the city slowly, like it was testing the air before committing. Savannah can be cruel with its seasons, too hot, too heavy, too sudden, but that year it softened. Mornings felt cleaner. Even the river seemed to move with a gentler rhythm. And for the first time in years, I let myself walk without purpose, not rushing to a crisis, not calculating schedules, not rehearsing answers before someone even asks the question, just moving. It felt unfamiliar, like trying on someone else's shoes, but it also felt right, a rightness that didn't demand explanation or permission. During one of those slow mornings, I stopped by an old cafe near the historic district. I used to pass it on my way to the facility, but never once went inside, too busy, too focused, too survival mode. But that day, I pushed open the door. The bell chimed, and a warm smell, coffee, cinnamon, something buttery, rolled over me. I sat by the window with a small notebook, the kind people use for dreams or grocery lists or the little things that keep them tethered to themselves. I hadn't touched a notebook for myself in years. It felt almost indulgent to lay it on the table, to open it without needing it for documentation or protocols. I didn't write anything. I just let it sit there, and there was something powerful in that stillness, choosing not to fill a space simply because I finally had room. The barista brought my drink with a smile that had no expectations attached to it, no hidden request, no assumption that I could solve something for her. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know what I carried. She didn't know what I had laid down. She just handed me a cup of coffee like I was an ordinary person. Being ordinary felt revolutionary. It wasn't long before small pieces of my old self, the parts buried under responsibility, pressure, and exhaustion, began to unfurl. I started reading novels again. I took long walks by the marsh. I let myself watch sunsets instead of fluorescent lights. I slept in on Sundays without waking up panicked, convinced I had forgotten something critical. Slowly, the world began to feel like something I belonged in, not something sitting on my shoulders. But peace is rarely uninterrupted. One afternoon, I received a message not from my parents, but from a staff member at one of the Allied facilities. His voice was tight, careful. Thought you should know. There's tension at the board meeting. They're asking questions Lina can't answer. Thanked him. And then I set the phone down. I didn't drive over. I didn't offer help. I didn't even ask for details. Because here's the quiet truth. If someone inherits a title without doing the work, the title eventually demands the work they avoided. Later that week, I visited another facility for an internal audit. It wasn't unusual. Harbor Bridge functioned on consistency and checks, not assumptions. After the walkthrough, I found myself sitting on a bench in the garden courtyard, surrounded by greenery and the soft hum of afternoon insects. A resident named Mr. Carter approached slowly with his walker, the same man who once joked, "I walked faster than the wind." "You look different," he said. I smiled faintly. "Good different?" He nodded. "Peaceful, like someone finally stopped trying to outrun their own shadow." The sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. It was accurate, painfully so. I had spent so many years running not toward anything, but away from collapse, away from disappointing people who never saw the labor behind every miracle. Now I was learning how to stand still. As he shuffled away, he added, "People don't always like when you stop carrying what they meant to hand you forever." We didn't need to say names. He didn't need to point to anyone. The truth was universal. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing a set of quarterly reports. Everything was stable. Everything was running. Not perfectly, nothing ever does, but steadily. Consistency is the quiet version of success, the version people overlook because it doesn't sparkle. In the middle of that calm, a memory hit me. A small one, but sharp. I was 12, watching my father scold a staff member for a mistake he himself had caused by giving unclear instructions. I stepped forward, trying to explain, but he cut me off. "Cara, don't interfere, let adults handle adult work." Funny how he forgot that philosophy when the adult work became inconvenient for him. Sometimes I wonder if families create the very storms they later drown in. If my parents had ever once taught Lina the systems I mastered by necessity, maybe she could have stepped into the role they built for her, but they didn't. They dressed her in expectations like costumes and dressed me in responsibility like armor. And now the costumes were crumbling, and the armor wasn't theirs to wear. One night, I got home and sat in my car with the engine off, watching the streetlights glow along the curb. I didn't rush inside. I just sat there, letting the quiet settle around me. For the first time, silence wasn't a warning, it was a companion. If you've ever reached that point where the quiet is no longer a threat, but a sign that your life is finally in your own hands, tell me, those moments shape people more deeply than loud victories ever can. Summer came heavy and slow, pressing its heat against the windows of every building in Savannah, the kind of heat that made the pavement shimmer and the air feel like thick fabric you had to push through. But inside Harbor Bridge, the rooms stayed cool, steady, predictable, something I had spent years ensuring without anyone realizing how delicate that balance truly was. My days found a rhythm that didn't revolve around crisis. It felt foreign, almost suspicious, the way calm can feel to someone who has spent years living at the edge of urgency. I would walk the halls and catch myself waiting for something to go wrong, waiting for the universe to snap its fingers and pull me back into the chaos I had once accepted as normal. But nothing snapped, nothing pulled. Life just continued. One afternoon, during a routine administrative review, I overheard two nurses talking in the break room. Nothing dramatic. They were laughing about a spill in the hallway, swapping stories from the early shift. Then one of them said, "Things just feel smoother lately." I waited for the familiar flicker of pride or the instinct to claim it. Instead, all I felt was a quiet warmth, a softness that wasn't tied to needing validation. Their words weren't meant for me. They weren't looking for my reaction. They were simply experiencing the stability I had worked years to build. That, I realized, was the truest reward. Not applause, not recognition, just the quiet knowledge that something you built keeps people safe without needing your fingerprints everywhere. But outside of Harbor Bridge, the dynamic in my family continued to unravel in small, brittle ways. My parents tried calling a second time, then a third. I didn't answer. I wasn't ignoring them out of bitterness. I just wasn't available in the way I once was. Not emotionally, not structurally, not spiritually. Being available is its own currency, and I had spent a lifetime giving it away for free. One evening, Lena sent a message, short, careful. Can we talk? I stared at it longer than I meant to. Not because it hurt, because it was honest in its simplicity. I didn't reply, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I wanted her to grow. You can't learn resilience secondhand. You can't inherit competence. You can't fake understanding. And you definitely can't shortcut humility. Those things are built through discomfort, confusion, trying, failing, and trying again. And until she reached that part of the journey, talking to her now would just repeat the cycle we had always lived in. Her reaching for reassurance and me smoothing the world beneath her feet. I wasn't going back to that role, not even gently. A few weeks later, at a regional care meeting, I saw her again. She sat at a long table beside other facility representatives, taking notes with a tight jaw and restless hands. She didn't notice I was across the room, or maybe she did, but pretended not to. Either way, she looked different, less polished, less curated, less floaty, more real. When the meeting ended, she gathered her things quickly, almost nervously. Papers slipped from her folder, and she crouched to pick them up with shaking hands. No one rushed to help, not out of cruelty, just because everyone else was managing their own materials, their own responsibilities. For the first time in her life, the room didn't orbit around her. She saw me watching. Her eyes flickered, confusion, embarrassment, something like longing. I held her gaze only long enough to acknowledge her effort, not her fragility. She looked away first. There's something heartbreaking about seeing someone step into adulthood late, awkwardly unprepared. But there's also something honest in it, the truth she had avoided all her life finally catching up. That night, as I walked to my car, the sky opened into one of those sudden southern summer storms. Warm rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking everything in seconds. I didn't run. I let it fall on me, cooling skin, washing away heat, grounding me. It felt like the universe was pressing a reset button I didn't know I needed. Lightning cracked somewhere in the distance, followed by a long, low growl of thunder. The storm rolled across the sky like a slow exhale. And standing there, drenched, I understood something that had been whispering at the edge of my mind for months. The letting go wasn't abandonment. It was trust that people would learn what they had refused to learn when I absorbed everything for them. When I finally got into my car, clothes dripping, hair stuck to my neck, I caught my own reflection in the mirror. I didn't look exhausted. I didn't look worn down. I didn't look like someone carrying the world on her back. I looked alive, clear-eyed, present. It startled me so much I almost laughed. Because when you spend years being defined by how useful you are, seeing yourself without weight is almost disorienting. You expect to look incomplete, but instead you look like someone returning to themselves after a long absence. Driving home through the storm, the windshield wipers fighting against the rain, I realized how many years I had survived without asking if I even wanted the life I was maintaining. Now, for the first time, the question felt safe to ask. What do I want? Not what needs to be done, not what do they expect, not who needs me right now. Just what do I want? For a moment, the question felt too large for the car, too large for the road, too large for the life I'd been living, but it wasn't frightening. It felt like the beginning of something unnamed and wide. If you've ever been in that moment where the rain hits your skin, the world quiets, and the question of your own life finally makes sense, I'd like to hear it. Those beginnings are rare and they're worth remembering. Autumn drifted in without ceremony, brushing the edges of the city with cooler mornings and softer evenings. Savannah does fall differently. No dramatic foliage, no cinematic bursts of color. Change arrives quietly here, slipping into the air like a secret. And maybe that's why those months became the clearest season of my life. Quiet change suited me. Harbor Bridge moved into its end of year cycle, reviews, budgets, winter preparations, staff evaluations. But even those predictable rhythms felt different now. I wasn't dragging myself through them. I wasn't surviving them. I was choosing them. That distinction changed everything. I'd arrive early some mornings and stand just inside the main doors, letting the morning sun spill across the tile. The building always felt alive at that hour in a gentle, purposeful way. Nurses greeting each other softly, volunteers setting up crafts, the distant clatter of breakfast trays. It was the kind of life that doesn't try to impress anyone. It just exists, honestly, steadily. Sometimes one of the residents would wave at me from down the hall. Other times, no one would even notice I walked in. And both felt right. I wasn't there to be seen. I wasn't there to be heroic. I was part of the infrastructure, the way a foundation is part of a house. Quietly essential, but not begging for recognition. Meanwhile, my parents continued drifting through the consequences of what they'd spent years ignoring. Bills piled, regulatory deadlines approached too quickly, deadlines were missed. Their world, once so carefully curated around Lina's shine, was now a house built on air. Every so often, I'd hear secondhand updates. They almost lost a license renewal. Their consultant walked out. They filed paperwork late again. Then I didn't understand the audit forms. It wasn't schadenfreude, it wasn't satisfaction, it was simply the truth unfolding in the natural order it had always been destined to follow. And Lina, she was changing, slowly, unevenly. Well, changing responsibility is the greatest mirror. It shows you what you actually know and who you actually are. One chilly morning during a routine systems meeting, she walked into the main office, not with her usual floating grace, not wearing the polished mask she relied on, but with the tentative humility of someone who had finally realized the size of the job she inherited. Her hair was pulled back imperfectly. Her notebook was messy with scribbles. She looked tired in the way only responsibility makes a person tired. Honestly, without theatric, she saw me and paused. Just a second, but long enough for the moment to settle. She approached slowly, almost cautiously. "Can I sit?" she asked. A simple question, but not one she had ever needed to ask before. I nodded and she took the chair beside me instead of across from me. Another small shift that said more than any apology ever could. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight between us wasn't hostility anymore. It was truth, raw, unpolished truth. "I didn't know," she said finally. Her voice wasn't defensive or rehearsed. It wasn't coded in entitlement or denial. It was thin, honest, almost painful. "I didn't know how much there was. I didn't know how much you did." The words trembled, and not out of weakness, out of realization. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't soften her discomfort. A lifetime of being handed shortcuts doesn't disappear in a single epiphany. She continued, staring down at her hands. I thought, I thought they gave me something real. I let the truth sit for a moment before answering. "They did, but real things are heavy." She nodded, a small, broken nod. "Why didn't they ever teach me? Why didn't they?" She stopped herself. The question hung unfinished because she already knew the answer. Parents don't teach the child they are protecting from the truth. They teach the child they trust with the truth. And she had never been the latter. Her eyes lifted, searching mine. "Are you angry?" It startled me how quickly I knew the answer. "No, this is the truth, the real truth, not the polite truth, not the expected truth, not the wound dressed as strength truth." I wasn't angry. I was done. "There's a difference. I'm just not carrying it anymore," I said. She nodded again, this time slower, deeper. "I don't think I can do this alone." There it was, the sentence she had been avoiding, the sentence that stripped away every illusion she'd been raised into. I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't offer solutions. I just said, "You don't have to do it alone. You just have to actually do it." Her eyes glistened. She blinked quickly, like the tears surprised her. It wasn't a reconciliation, it wasn't a forgiveness scene. Uh, it wasn't a sudden mending of everything. It was the first honest conversation we'd ever had. After the meeting, I watched her walk down the hall, not floating, not posing, not glowing, just walking, grounded, a little heavier, but real. Sometimes the first step into adulthood is admitting you weren't ready for the role you demanded. Later that day, I found myself sitting in the courtyard again, near the fountain that always sounded like rain, even on the hottest days. Leaves drifted across the concrete. A squirrel darted across the bench beside me, pausing as if to check whether I belonged here. I belonged more than ever. Peace didn't mean the absence of responsibility. Peace meant the absence of misplaced responsibility. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying anyone else's unfinished chapters. If you've ever reached that point where peace isn't soft but earned, where it doesn't whisper but rings quietly through you, I'd like to hear it. It's one of the rarest shifts a person can experience, and when it happens, you never return to who you were before. Winter arrived with a quiet kind of cold, the kind that doesn't roar in with storms but settles in like a long exhale. Savannah winters aren't dramatic, they're subtle. Bare trees, pale mornings, thin breezes slipping through door frames. The world doesn't freeze, it just slows down enough to make your thoughts louder. That winter, my life felt like it had been rearranged into something I could finally recognize. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just mine. One morning, I sat in my office with the blinds half open, watching the sun break through a low band of clouds. The light caught in the dust floating above my desk, tiny dancing particles reminding me how much you can see when you finally stop rushing past your own life. I reviewed a set of reports, wrote a few notes, signed off on a compliance update, responded to messages. Work was still work. The difference was the absence of weight that never belonged to me in the first place. Around mid-morning, a knock tapped against my office door. When I looked up, Lina stood there, coat draped over her arm, cheeks flushed from the cold, not timid, not defiant, just present. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. She'd never asked before for anything. She used to assume my time was an extension of whatever she needed. But this was different, a small shift, but important. I nodded and she stepped inside. She sat not across from me this time, not positioned like an opposing side in an argument, but beside me, angled just slightly toward the window. She didn't speak immediately. Her fingers traced the seam of her coat, pulling threads that didn't need pulling. It reminded me of childhood, how she used to tug her sleeves when she was trying to be brave. "I've been doing the rounds," she said finally, "the real rounds, not the tours." And I waited. "It's harder than I thought." A tiny laugh, soft, self-awares, carrying no defensiveness. "I don't think I realized how much you can't fake." I almost told her she didn't need to explain, but no, she did. For herself, not for me. She looked down at her hands. "I resented you for a long time. I thought you were trying to make me feel small." Her voice didn't tremble this time, it just lowered. "But I think I made myself small because that was easier than being responsible." I stayed quiet and let her sit with her own truth. It belonged to her, not me. She exhaled slowly. "Mom and Dad, they thought they were helping me, protecting me, but they weren't preparing me for anything real." There it was, the realization she had needed for years. "They were preparing you," she added softly. I looked at her, not as the sister who had always floated through life, not as the favorite, not as the chosen one, but as a person finally learning the difference between being adored and being capable. Sometimes the world shapes us unfairly. Sometimes parents create imbalance without meaning to, and sometimes the children who were coddled grow up and finally see the cost, both to themselves and to the sibling who held the weight they escaped. She wiped at the corner of one eye. I don't want to be the person they built me into. I want to be someone who can stand on my own legs. It wasn't an apology, it was something more honest, responsibility. I closed my tablet. What do you need? She shook her head. Not a shortcut, not a rescue, just guidance. That word carried more humility than any apology ever could. Guidance doesn't mean carrying someone, it means walking at your own pace while they learn theirs. I can offer that, I said, as long as you're the one doing the work. Her relief was visible, not because she wanted it to be easy, but because she finally wanted it to be real. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking for praise, she was looking for skill. She stood to leave, then paused. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you did and everything you stopped doing." That last part was the truest gratitude I had ever received. When she left the room, I sat back in my chair and let the quiet fill the space. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't lonely. It was steady. Later that afternoon, I drove to a different facility for an unannounced review. Not to catch anyone off guard, but to feel the pulse of the system I spent years refining. Walking through those halls, I realized how rarely anyone sees the architecture of their own labor until they step back from the scaffolding. Staff moved confidently, charts were clean, shifts were balanced, residents were attended to. Nothing perfect, but everything solid. The kind of environment built from consistency, not charisma. I paused near the therapy room and watched a group playing a simple word game. One of the residents laughed, a full-bodied, easy sound. Life, imperfect and beautiful, carried on. Outside, dusk had already started settling, painting the parking lot in long shadows and soft gold light. The air had that crisp edge that only arrives in the deepest weeks of winter. I stood there, wrapped in the quiet, and pulled my coat tighter around me. I thought about my parents, not with anger, but with distance. They hadn't tried to ruin me, they had simply failed to see me. And somewhere along the line, I had stopped needing them to. That, too, was freedom. Weeks later, I visited the Riverwalk, one of the places I used to avoid because it reminded me of people with time, something I didn't have for most of my life. The breeze was cool and honest, the sky pale. A few families walked by wrapped in scarves and conversation. I sat on a bench and watched the water move, slow and deliberate. It struck me how rivers don't fight their own direction. They don't argue with their past. They don't hold on to the stones that scrape them. They just move, reshaping themselves around whatever gets in their way. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the cold air fill my lungs. It felt like clarity, like a chapter closing, not slammed shut, not ripped away, just turned with a steady, quiet hand. And in that moment, a final truth settled in. Freedom didn't arrive when I removed myself from my family's expectations. Freedom arrived when I finally accepted I never needed their permission to begin. I stood from the bench, hands warm in my pockets, shoulders light. As I walked back toward the city, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and winter jasmine, a scent that felt like endings and beginnings tied together. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever laid something heavy down and found your hands shaking from the absence more than the weight, I'd like to hear it. Stories like this find each other. They always do. More are coming.